Hello, BookTube. I have a tag for you today. I was tagged by Josh at Literary Gladiators a long time ago, and it somehow got right by me. I think that's not the only Literary Gladiators tag that has somehow got right by me. That has to stop. They make great tags. I didn't really get nudged to do this one until I saw other people doing it on BookTube. I like to be right out of the starting gate. So this is the short stories on BookTube tag, and I was actually tagged. Josh tagged me. I don't know why I didn't do it right away, but it concentrates on short stories, your favorites, your dreams, all that sort of stuff. And as usual, when I do a tag, I write out the questions and then walk around my library, sort of thinking about them and pulling down books and looking at them. It's an awful lot of fun. The behind-the-scenes stuff that isn't even filmed in a tag is an awful lot of fun, much less the tag itself. And it didn't take me long doing that to realize that this tag is completely impossible. This is a 20-something tag for 20-something readers. It will not be possible. At least for me, it isn't possible for after a lifetime of reading short stories. I have read a mountain of short stories, just a mountain of them. Good, bad, every genre. For decades. I haven't missed a short story in the New Yorker in 60 years, for Pete's sake. And that's just the New Yorker. There's the Atlantic and Harper's. There's lots of magazines that aren't in print anymore. Tons of genre stuff. Ridiculous. Plus online. No. I quickly realized that it was just impossible, that I couldn't possibly do this tag unless I narrow the field myself. So I did. I narrowed the field to science fiction and fantasy. And even that is monstrously impossible. Just monstrously. Science fiction and fantasy, the genre got its start in novels by H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and Mary Shelley. But I don't think I'm the only one who thinks that it achieved its first blush of greatness in the short form, not in novels. There was a long period of time where in the 20th century, especially, where you could not expect to sell a science fiction novel in anything like the same kind of numbers of distribution as you did a mainstream novel. I remember when the first time a science fiction novel made the New York Times bestseller list, and it was a big deal for those of us who love the genre. Whereas science fiction short stories, everywhere. They're everywhere. From free homemade zines all the way up to the glossy magazines of the genre. So even here was difficult, and I could go on for a very long time talking about great short stories, new and old, in science fiction and fantasy. But instead, I'm going to try to control my answers just a bit, and I will try to remember to jot them down as well. So question number one is, do you read and write short stories, or do you just read them? And I have written short stories before. Usually, the only time that I will write a short story is if the whole thing comes to me just at a shot. I'm not particularly willing to get down in the trenches and do lots of agonizing and revisioning and creeping through a short story like I would a much longer work of fiction. So if a short story comes to me, not just the idea, but the execution, and that has happened many times to me, then I will do it. Then it will bother me if I don't do it. But otherwise, no, I just read them. Question number two. Perfect example of the impossibility of this tag. Question number two is, what is your favorite short story? What is your favorite short story? How on earth am I supposed to answer that? David Murphy just did this tag, spent almost the whole time on Leo Tolstoy. I could easily do that too. And what about Chekhov? And what about Guy de Maupassant? A million Spanish writers. No. So if we clamp it down to science fiction and fantasy, that's still really hard, because science fiction and fantasy is absolutely full of classic short stories. I jotted down some of them just so that I wouldn't forget. A more recent one from about 10 years ago, The Man Who Bridged the Mists by Kij Johnson, K-I-J Johnson. What a short story. Really longer, so probably a novella. What a story. Just fantastic. But also, we have some classics. Like, for instance, the science fiction author James Tiptree wrote a couple of novels, but was a master of the short story form. There are 20 short stories that she wrote that are all great. The one I chose was The Women Men Don't See, but it could easily have been all 19 of the others. The psychiatrist who would not do awful things to rats. is another one. Beam Us Home. I woke and found me here on this hillside. Your sisters, oh my faces, oh my sisters, your faces filled of light. These are My Haploid Heart. She wrote great short stories, just fantastic short stories. The Women Men Don't See, I think, I've always got the impression that it was one of the more personal. It resonates a little more, I think, but I could have used many others. Then another science fiction author that I wanted to mention, I could do this forever, but I wanted to mention Cordwainer Smith. He's not known now. I don't think he's in print now. And he wrote a large number of stories, all relatively connected. They were in a shared universe of the instrumentality of mankind. And quite a lot of those are very good, including Alpha Ralpha Boulevard. But probably the earliest one of those stories, the one that I don't think was conceived as part of that continuum, is a great story called Scanners Live in Vain. And I had to mention that before, while I was on the question of favorites. But really, when it comes to your favorite short story, you're not, I mean, you could be if you have excellent taste. I've never been accused of having excellent taste. Really, what it comes down to is the one you yourself just like the most, your favorite, as opposed to the most worthy. And I'm not to sell this one short at all. It's a story I've mentioned many times on this channel before. It's The Ugly Chickens by Howard Waldrop, which doesn't really have any science fiction or fantasy in it. I would argue that Your Faces, Oh My Sisters, Your Faces Filled of Light by James Tiptree also doesn't have any science fiction in it. But The Ugly Chickens is really just alternate history. It's really a what-if story, and I just love it. I imagine for its sweep and its language use and its originality, probably it's not as great as any of these others, but it's still my favorite. I still love it. I reread it all the time. And again, I could go on. I could go on this. Like, for instance, The Kith of the Elf Folk by Lord Dunsany, about a little fairy creature, a swamp fairy creature that floats over the dark water of the swamps and marshes at night and dreams of having a soul. What a story. Oh my God, what a story. Anyway, let's just move on. What is your favorite short story collection? The one I mentioned, the one I wrote down here is The Science Fiction Century by David Hartwell, but really any David Hartwell big collection. He also did a book called The Ascent of Wonder, which is incredible. He is a fantastic anthology editor, just for science fiction, just fantastic. The Science Fiction Century I really like because not only the eclectic mix of stuff, but also because it spans, as the title implies, the whole length of the genre, the whole lifespan, and I really like that. Again, it's an anthology, even though I've read every story in it, and even though I had read most of the stories in it before I read it, something about it draws me back to reread it many times. Question number 4, who are some of your favorite short story writers? And again, we're talking just science fiction and fantasy here. I made a list of some. There are plenty of others. I mentioned James Tiptree. James Tiptree's short stories are... Once upon a time, there were, I think, 4 mass market paperbacks of them. And Warm Worlds and Otherwise, Star Songs of an Old Primate, Out of the Everywhere. They just wonderful, wonderful stuff. 10,000 Light Years from Home. That just collected a lot of her short stories. I would really like a big, beautiful, well-made collection of her short stories. That would be really nice. I'm not going to name names, but I've seen science fiction authors with far less talent get that kind of treatment. It would be nice if I imagine I'm not the only one who encountered and came to love Tiptree through her short stories rather than Up the Walls of the World or Brightness Falls from the Air. So those short stories deserve that kind of royal treatment and haven't had it. Also, Robert Silverberg, who, as of this filming, is still alive, still with us. God bless him. He's like 170 years old. And a lot of his great work is short stories. He's known for lots and lots of other things. He's been doing commentary. He did good nonfiction work, did tons of really good novels in some series, did what I consider to be a great standalone novel called Dying Inside. But he also did lots and lots of short stories. In fact, if I'm not remembering right off the top of my head, maybe Mark at Richardson Reeves was no, but I want to say that Dying Inside also started as a short story, like so many of these things did. So many science fiction novels that have gone into the canon started as short stories. But he wrote a ton of them, and again, I don't think they've all been collected, but they're tremendously good. He's a tremendously smart writer. I could also mention Gene Wolfe, who just recently died, and his short stories are fantastic, just fantastic. And also Alan Dean Foster, who is he's a workhorse. He's written lots and lots of things, some better than others. He never really turns down a book contract. And a long, long time ago, probably 45 years ago, he did a pair of short story collected volumes called With Friends Like These, and then the second volume was Who Needs Enemies. And a lot of the stories in those volumes they still hold up. They're still really, really good. But who else do I have down here? I mentioned Cordwainer Smith again. His his short stories are they are amazing. They center around a consistent imagined future. But they wander all over that future. And, when we talk about a series of short stories in science fiction and fantasy that are centered around an imagined future but wander all around its own time continuum, there's also Robert E. Howard, of course, the Conan stories that are incredible. But who else I have here? Lord Dunsany. I already mentioned Lord Dunsany, the Kith of the Elf Folk, but also lots of other short stories, and all of them so quotably good. Also Connie Willis and Nancy Kress, two great short story writers. They've done other stuff, but it's their short stories that I remember them by. And also, while we're on the subject of science fiction and fantasy short story writers, I really should make a plug for someone who really hasn't caught the attention of the non-science fiction world. He is a pure creature of the science fiction magazines, the science fiction publication world. He's written novels, but he is an absolute master of the science fiction short story. His name's Robert Reed. Not the actor who played Mr. Brady on the Brady Bunch, but rather an institution in his own right. Just amazing. And when you see him in a science fiction or fantasy periodical of some kind, when you see a story of his, you know you're going to like it. You know it's going to be really good. And even a really practiced science fiction or fantasy short story writer, you can't always say that about them. Sometimes they might have an off day. Sometimes they might, out of hubris or laziness, decide to chip off a bit of a novel and make it into a short story and not see that it doesn't work that way. Robert Reed's are always just wonderfully done. So I wanted to mention him in terms of favorites, but I could go on forever. So let's just move on here. I just looked at my list and I realized I forgot one person, probably Freudian, that I forgot him. Harlan Ellison, the science fiction author and provocateur, and also the author of the greatest Star Trek episode in any franchise that's ever been done. Harlan Ellison, he and I had a rather spotty relationship but as calmer years prevail and as I look back, I can't help but say Harlan Ellison, for whatever I might have thought about how he ran his mouth, his short stories are great. They are just great. If you don't, I don't think it's in print anymore, but if you ever see it in the used bookstore, the big Essential Ellison with a beautiful cover illustration, just grab it. The Essential Ellison is a lifetime of reading between two covers. You'll never get tired of it. I had to mention him. I Freudianly forgot him, but I have to mention him if this story comes up. So Liz here, question number 5: do you like a particular outlet for finding short stories? Individual author collections, anthologies, magazines, and for a long time, when it comes to science fiction and fantasy, for a long time, the anthology was Gardner Dozois, who did one every year and had a huge introductory essay, a sort of survey of the world of science fiction in the previous year, and then his picks and those anthologies got very big and were very substantial. And once again, he and I didn't always agree. When he was alive, we didn't always agree. And certainly I don't agree with his editorial vision at all. There was not a year that he put together the year's best science fiction when I would not have put together an almost completely different volume. But that actually makes them worthwhile, obviously. That makes them great to read. So, obviously, when it comes to anthology series, it would be that. As far as I know, I have never speculatively bought a collection of an author's short stories without knowing anything about them. Usually I've found them. I know already that I like them. But when it comes to periodicals, I have mentioned them before. There are 3 that I would not miss, and that if you're a science fiction or fantasy fan, I strongly recommend them. And I recommend just subscribing to them. These little square-bound printed magazines like this live off their subscription list. It's so important. I would do it if I kind of like I have a ritual where I go and I get them. I get the physical issues. And that's great if you never miss and if you always do that. But a lot of places, a lot of readers won't have access to that. I mean, but anyway, I've shown them on this channel before. There are these three: fantasy and science fiction, Asimov science fiction, and analog science fiction and fact. There are these three. The subscription to all three of them together would probably be about maybe $150 for all three together. And you get for that columns, including one by Robert Silverberg. You get industry updates. You get short stories, novellas, short novels. You get reviews. It's amazing. It's amazing. And I'm pretty sure that if you subscribe, electronically, which I have resisted doing, I'm pretty sure that if you do that, you get access to the vast back catalog, which is a treasure in its own right. You could lose yourself reading in there. But the thing I wanted to mention, the thing I've mentioned about these things before, is that in every individual issue that you get in the mail or that you get on the newsstand, every single one has at least one story that does that thing that the best short stories do. The short stories we end up really liking. You know when you're plodding through a short story and you think, okay, I get what you're doing here, and you have 3 pages. Okay, that's done. But then you get to a short story and it's just a jolt of electricity going through you, because it's fantastic. The type of thing you're going to miss a subway stop to continue reading. And every issue of these 3 has at least one story like that. Sometimes they have 2, sometimes 3. Every once in a great while, the whole issue will be like that. But at least at least one of those stories in every issue. If you think about that for a minute, that's amazing. That right there is worth the subscription cost. So those are my main venues there. And then I also read the Year's Best series that started out with the Year's Best short stories, and they now do everything. They now do every kind of genre, and they do Year's Best science fiction and fantasy, and I never miss that. I don't know. I would imagine that the Year's Best science fiction, the anthology series that Gardner Dozois did for 35 years, I imagine that will continue under someone else's helm. I can't imagine it would just lapse. I don't know. And before him, there were others. There was the great Terry Carr, who did also a Year's Best science fiction. So plenty of different venues, but I wouldn't miss these magazines for all the mud in Egypt. So let's see here. Where do we go on here? Question number 6. How short do you like your short stories? I'm going to resist the urge to say the shorter the better. I'm not, I admit. I've made clear on this channel, I'm not an overwhelming fan of the made-up stories. So when it comes to literary short stories, for instance, the stuff you would see in Harper's or the Atlantic or the New Yorker, oh my God, the New Yorker. With those, I'm usually hoping that they're nice and short, because they're often so bad. They're often so bad. Okay, you have 3 columns on a page. You have 5 pages. I've gone through 3 of those pages so far with 3 columns on each page. And so far, nothing has happened in the story and no one has said a word. It's been you just wool gathering. Well, okay, that's great. If I want to listen to you pointlessly wool gather, I'll elbow my way into a literary launch party in the Upper West Side and listen to you al fresco. But I don't need to pay to do that and read your limp, wan, unexciting, boring, derivative prose while I do it. So in cases like that, my ideal length is pretty short. You're already boring me. You didn't come to this story with any kind of conviction. So, the sooner you wrap it up or just drop it and lose interest and go back to snorting coke, the better I like it. But if we're talking about science fiction and a well-constructed short story, every once in a while, the New Yorker will have a good short story, for instance, and other places too. If we're talking something like that, then I want probably 10 to 20 pages. I think that short stories really benefit by being hewed and truncated, almost poetry style. A short story that wanders on, it's got to have a real good reason to do that. Although otherwise no. Otherwise I start to think of it as something else, a novella or a short novel or something like that. And question number 7, what do you feel makes a good short story? For science fiction and fantasy, I would actually hold this is probably true for all genres, but for science fiction and fantasy, it is that does the short story, no matter how short it is, present me with a complete world. A complete and rounded off, self-contained world. That's what I want it to do. I don't care how hard the learning curve is to get into that world. I'm perfectly okay with the first 5 pages of a science fiction short story being virtually incomprehensible to me, and that I just have to claw along, piecing things together and trying to keep up. I'm perfectly okay with that, provided it all makes sense at the end, or at least a kind of sense, provided I am inside that world instead of outside it by the time the story ends. But that's what I want. I don't want a story that feels incomplete, where I have lots of important questions at the end. It's okay to have some questions about the characters, but not important questions about why you just went through that. And I don't want to have questions like that, but I also don't want the world to be already known to me. In a science fiction or fantasy story, I want it to be a complete new world. So that's number 1 for me, absolutely. Then question number 8. Which short story writer do you want to read or read more? And which short story writer do I want to read more? Would be all of them. Which ones do I want to read? Well, the ones I want to read I have read. I just want to read more of them. I want to read more of everybody. I love it that we still have a vestige of the old short story market where somebody can actually sell a short story. I love that. I love the fact that that's true. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of what it was even 50 years ago, but it's still around. And when it comes to short stories, I firmly believe that even somebody who has disappointed me 50 times in a row might do one that I really like. It doesn't always happen. It's in fact kind of rare. I think because ruts set in. You get a venue like the New Yorker or something like, not to keep bashing on the New Yorker, but you get a venue like them and you get a formula of a short story. You realize they'll take it, and you realize that their editors won't touch it much, and you realize that their readers will feel kind of comfortable seeing it there, and suddenly you start generating that story over and over and over and over and over again. That happens a lot. That happens with living authors who are considered great just for doing that, which boggles my mind. It happens with authors who are dead now, who had regular berths at the New Yorker and elsewhere, writing the same story over and over again. Nothing quite wrong with that, but I mean, I have been a fan in my time of short story writers who did that. I've also hated short story writers who did that. It all depends on the tenor, the register, whether or not I think they're carrying it off. For instance, there isn't much to distinguish the short stories of John Updike and Louis Auchincloss, and yet the one I hate and the other I love. So, but either way, every single time there's that chance, there's that thrill, and unlike with a novel, you don't have to wait forever to see if there is something new or subversive. You're going to get it in 20 pages. That makes me want to read more short stories from everybody, even people who've disappointed me. And that is it. That is the short stories on BookTube tag. All that's left is to tag people. But like I said, people have been doing this. I somehow missed it. So I have no idea who's done this tag. So I'm going to fall back on the usual lameoid. If you are interested in this, please do it. Consider yourself tagged by me and do it. Because the more recommendations I get for short stories, the better I like it. So I'm going to wrap this up for now. But we've got other bookish stuff to talk about. So I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.